The coffee cup shattered on the mahogany desk at 9:47 on Christmas Eve, and the sound was the loudest thing on the 16th floor of Crestline Capitol. Ethan Caldwell had slammed both fists down so hard the ceramic split against the wood grain, sending a spray of cold black coffee across the termination letter that sat between him and the woman who controlled his future. Catherine Mercer did not flinch. She did not blink. She sat behind that desk the way she had sat behind it for 22 years, with the Manhattan skyline glowing through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind her like a crown she had clawed out of the world with her own hands. Her fingers were laced on the desk surface. Her posture was absolute. She slid the document 2 inches closer to him with one manicured finger, and her voice carried the temperature of the January air outside. "Sign it, Ethan. Security is waiting." Outside that office, through the frosted glass wall, a little girl sat on a cold leather chair in the hallway. 8 years old, red coat buttoned to her chin, a candy cane clutched in her right hand, the cellophane wrapper crinkling every time she shifted her weight. Her legs dangled above the floor because the chair was built for adults, not for children, who had been brought to their father's office building on Christmas Eve because the babysitter's shift ended at 9 and there was nowhere else for her to go. She was waiting for her daddy to come out so they could go home and make cookies. She did not know what was happening on the other side of that glass. She only knew he had been in there too long, and the candy cane was getting sticky in her warm palm. Ethan signed. He picked up the pen and he signed his name at the bottom of the document that said he was terminated for cause, that said his performance had been deficient, that said the losses in his division were his responsibility, and he signed it because the man standing by the window, Martin Keene, vice president of finance, had orchestrated every word on that page, and there was no court of appeals in a corner office at 10 o'clock at night. He signed it because his daughter was outside, and every minute he spent arguing was a minute she spent alone in a hallway wondering why Christmas Eve felt wrong. He stood. He looked at Catherine Mercer, and he looked at Martin Keene, and something in his voice had gone past anger into a place that was colder and more permanent. "I want you both to know something. I did everything right. I documented everything. I warned everyone I was supposed to warn, and you chose not to listen." His eyes found Martin's, held them. "You know what you did." Martin Keene did not blink. His face was a mask of professional concern, the kind of expression that costs nothing and conceals everything. Ethan turned and walked out. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and the lobby hit him like a hallucination. A massive Christmas tree stood in the center of the marble atrium covered in white lights. Holiday music drifted through the speakers, something soft and orchestral, the kind of music that fills corporate spaces in December, to remind people that the season of generosity exists even in buildings where generosity is a quarterly line item. The security guard at the front desk nodded at him without knowing, and there on the leather bench near the revolving door was Sophie. She saw him and jumped down. "Daddy!" She threw her arms around his waist, and he knelt and held her so tight that for a moment the cardboard box under his arm, the termination letter in his coat pocket, the security camera recording his exit from above, none of it existed. Just her. The smell of her shampoo and the scratch of her red coat against his chin and the pressure of her small arms around his neck holding on. "Are we going home now?" "Yes, sweetheart, we're going home." She looked at the box. "Why do you have that?" "Bringing some things from my desk, that's all." Sophie looked at his face. She had her mother's eyes dark and direct, and she used them the way her mother had used them to see past whatever story the adults were telling. Children see what adults hide. She did not ask another question. She took his hand and they walked through the revolving door into the falling snow, and behind them the building kept on glowing and the music kept on playing, and the world kept on turning the way it always does when one man's life collapses and nobody notices. But what Catherine Mercer did not know, what nobody in that building knew, was that Ethan Caldwell had proof. And proof does not die just because you fire the man holding it. 4 days. That was how long Ethan had gone without sleep before Christmas Eve. 4 days of pulling transaction records from Crestline Capital's trading platform, cross-referencing account numbers that did not match, staring at a screen full of numbers that told him something was not just wrong but deliberate. He was a risk analyst. That was his job. Monitor exposure flag anomalies, make sure the trade stayed within the parameters that kept the firm solvent and the regulators satisfied. He had been doing it for 8 years, and he was good at it, not because he had graduated from some Ivy League program that taught you to speak the language of money, but because he paid attention. That was the skill Henry Caldwell had drilled into his son from the time Ethan was old enough to hold a flashlight in a fuse box. Pay attention to what the numbers are telling you. Don't assume. Verify. His father had been an electrician in Pittsburgh for 40 years, a man who wired houses and office buildings and hospital wings, a man whose work was invisible until something went wrong. And the lesson he taught above all others was this: the people who build the things nobody sees are the only reason the lights come on. Ethan had carried that lesson into a world his father never imagined. He had taken it from the row houses of Pittsburgh to a glass tower in Manhattan, from a state school diploma that nobody at Crestline ever asked about to a desk on the 14th floor, where he sat every day surrounded by people who had attended schools whose names opened doors Ethan did not even know existed until he was already inside the building. He did not resent them. He did not envy them. He simply worked harder than most of them because working hard was the only currency he had ever known, and it had been enough to keep his job enough to earn the quiet respect of the people who actually understood what the risk management division did enough to pay the rent on a 2-bedroom apartment in Astoria and keep his daughter fed and clothed and enrolled in a school where the teachers knew her name. That was all he wanted. Not a corner office, not a seat at the table where decisions were made. Just to do his job well and go home to Sophie and maintain the fragile architecture of a life he had rebuilt after Grace died. Grace. 2 years gone and the name still hit like a fist to the sternum. Grace Caldwell, née Patterson, had been a third-grade teacher in Queens who laughed louder than anyone in the room and could quiet a classroom of 30 children with a single raised eyebrow. She had started coughing in September. By October, the cough had not gone away. By November, the doctors had found what they were looking for, and by the following May, she was gone. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that does not negotiate. The kind that takes a woman who was making lesson plans on Monday and puts her in hospice by Friday and leaves a man standing in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning holding a plastic bag of her personal belongings while his mother-in-law sobs in the waiting room and his daughter sleeps in a chair because nobody had the heart to wake her up and tell her that the world had just changed forever. Grace had been the one who taught Sophie to read before kindergarten, sitting together on the couch every evening with chapter books, while Ethan made dinner building in the girl a hunger for words that would outlast everything else Grace left behind. After the funeral Ethan had rebuilt, that was the word he used inside his own head because it was an electrician's word, a builder's word, a word that meant you looked at what was broken and you figured out how to make it work again. He rebuilt his mornings around Sophie's school schedule. He rebuilt his evenings around bedtime stories and bath time, and the particular way she liked her grilled cheese cut into triangles because that was how Grace used to do it. He rebuilt his weekends around the park and the library and the small rituals that kept a child's life feeling stable even when the foundation underneath had cracked straight through. And he rebuilt his sense of purpose around Crestline Capital because the work gave him structure and the paycheck kept them alive. And the routine of showing up every day and doing something well was the only therapy he could afford. Then the numbers started screaming. It began in September, a series of trades executed between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the building was empty and the compliance systems were running on minimal protocols. Overnight transactions were not unusual in themselves. Global markets operated around the clock, and automated systems placed orders based on algorithms that did not care what time it was in New York. But these trades were not automated. They were manual entries. Someone had logged into the trading platform using credentials that should have been dormant at that hour and had executed a series of high-exposure positions that fell outside every parameter Ethan's department was responsible for monitoring. The amounts were not small. The first cluster totaled $11 million. The second, 3 weeks later, added another 14. By mid-November, the cumulative exposure had reached $40 million, and Ethan was spending his nights at his desk trying to understand how it had happened and who was responsible. He followed the trail the way his father had taught him to trace a circuit, start at the source, follow the wire test every junction. The credentials used to execute the trades were not assigned to anyone on his team. They were administrator-level access codes, the kind that only senior executives possessed, the kind that could bypass the automated risk checks that would have flagged a trade of that size. Ethan cross-referenced the credential registry. The codes were assigned to the Office of the Vice President of Finance, Martin Keene's office. The realization settled into Ethan's chest like concrete. He had sent 3 emails to Martin Keene in October, risk reports, flagging the anomalies, requesting clarification, asking for an independent review. Martin had not responded to any of them. At the time, Ethan had assumed the usual bureaucratic explanation: the VP was busy. The emails had been buried under higher priority correspondence. The system had filtered them into a folder that nobody checked. Now he understood. Martin Keene had not missed those emails. He had read them and decided to do nothing because Martin Keene was the one executing the trades. That night, Christmas Eve, sitting alone on the 14th floor at 9:47, with cold coffee and burning eyes, Ethan picked up his phone and called the only person inside that building he trusted. James Brennan answered on the second ring. His voice was sleep-rough and incredulous. "Dan, it's Christmas Eve. What are you still doing there?" "I found it." Ethan's voice was flat. "The gap, the 40 million. James, it wasn't a system error. Somebody moved that money on purpose. I've got timestamps. I've got login credentials, and they don't belong to anyone on my team." Silence on the line. Then James exhaled. "You need to be very careful with what you're saying right now." "I'm saying someone inside this company committed fraud and they're using my department as a cover. I sent 3 emails to Martin Keene last month. Risk reports, internal memos. Flagged every anomaly." Complete silence. James paused. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "Martin Keene is the Vice President of Finance, Ethan. He's Catherine Mercer's right hand. If he's not responding to you, there's a reason." "Yeah, and I think the reason is that he's the one doing it." Another silence, longer this time. Ethan could hear James's wife talking in the background, the sound of a television playing holiday programming, the ordinary sounds of a home where Christmas Eve was proceeding the way it was supposed to. "Ethan, go home. Pick up Sophie. Have Christmas with your daughter. Do not send another email tonight. Do not talk to anyone. We'll figure this out after the holidays." "You're probably right." "I am right. Go home." Ethan saved every file. He backed up everything to his personal external drive, a habit he had developed years ago after a system crash wiped 3 months of compliance reports. He printed key documents, slid them into his messenger bag, and shut down his computer. But before he left, he did something that would matter more than anything else he had done that night. He called Kevin Marshall. Kevin Marshall was an IT infrastructure engineer at Crestline, a quiet man who worked in the basement server room and spoke to almost nobody outside his team. Ethan had helped Kevin navigate a health insurance dispute 2 years earlier, a billing error that had threatened to bankrupt Kevin's family during his wife's surgery, and Kevin had never forgotten it. 3 months ago, when Ethan first noticed the irregular overnight trades, he had asked Kevin to pull the access logs for the trading terminals. Kevin had not asked why. He trusted Ethan the way people trust the man who once sat with them in an HR office for 4 hours fighting a claim that nobody else would touch. Kevin sent the data. Those logs showed that between midnight and 4 in the morning on 18 separate occasions, someone had accessed the trading system using an administrator credential assigned to Martin Keene's office. Not Ethan's team, not anyone in risk management. Martin Keene's personal access code used from a terminal inside the building during hours when the building was supposed to be empty. Ethan had not included those logs in his emails to Martin. He was not stupid. If Martin was the one running the trade, sending him evidence of his own guilt would be handing him the chance to destroy it. So Ethan had kept those logs separate, saved on a thumb drive, locked in a fireproof box in the back of his bedroom closet behind Sophie's old baby clothes and the winter blankets Grace had bought at a clearance sale the year before she got sick. The box was still there. The evidence was intact, and it was going to matter. 2 floors above the 14th, while Ethan was shutting down his computer and heading for the elevator, a very different conversation was already happening. Catherine Mercer sat behind her desk on the 16th floor, and she was furious. Not the loud kind of fury. Catherine Mercer did not raise her voice, but the cold, pressurized kind that builds behind the eyes of a woman who has spent 22 years making herself untouchable and has just been told that something on her watch has gone very badly wrong. $40 million. That was the number Martin Keene had placed in front of her, and the number sat in the air between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Martin sat across from her, legs crossed, hands folded, calm. The kind of calm that should have been a warning, but Catherine did not see it because she had known this man for 12 years, and in 12 years he had never given her a reason to doubt him. He had been at Grace Caldwell's memorial service. He had shaken Ethan's hand and told him that if he ever needed anything, his door was open. He had stood beside Catherine through 3 hostile board meetings, 2 regulatory audits, and a market crash that had nearly killed the firm. He was her lieutenant. He was the person she called when the numbers didn't add up, and she trusted him the way you trust a wall that has held up the roof for a decade absolutely without inspection, because checking would mean admitting that the structure might not be as sound as you believe. That trust was the weapon Martin was counting on. He slid a folder across her desk, clean, organized. Every page a piece of evidence pointing exactly where he wanted it to point. The trades were executed using credentials assigned to Ethan Caldwell's team. The risk management protocols Ethan was supposed to enforce had been bypassed. The exposure had accumulated over 8 weeks, while Ethan's department filed reports that showed nothing unusual. The conclusion was obvious: either Ethan had been negligent to a degree that bordered on criminal, or he had been complicit. What Catherine did not know, what Martin had spent 3 weeks making certain she would never discover, was that every piece of evidence in that folder had been fabricated. Every falsified timestamp, every rerouted login credential, every deleted email trail, all of it constructed with the meticulous patience of a man who understood that the difference between getting caught and getting away with it was not the size of the lie, but the credibility of the person telling it. Martin King was credible. He was the vice president of finance. He wore the right suits. He attended the right dinners. He spoke the language of boardrooms and quarterly earnings and fiduciary responsibility. And the man he was framing wore off-the-rack shirts and had graduated from Penn State and ate lunch at his desk because he could not afford the restaurants where the rest of the senior staff gathered to discuss promotions and politics and who was in and who was out. Ethan Caldwell was perfect, not because he was guilty, but because he was invisible. A widowed father, a mid-level analyst, quiet, hardworking, the kind of man who solved problems instead of making noise, the kind of man no one would fight for. His personal situation has been affecting his focus, Martin said, his voice carrying the practiced tone of reluctant concern. He's a single father. His wife passed 2 years ago. I've tried to be patient, but this level of negligence can't be overlooked. Catherine looked at the folder. Then she looked at Martin. You're recommending termination. I'm recommending you protect this company. If the board finds out about this loss and sees that we kept the responsible party on staff, they'll come after you, Catherine, not him. You. She stared at the numbers. The calculation behind her eyes was fast and cold, the same calculation that had built this company, that had survived every crisis, that had made her the most feared CEO on the 32nd floor of the regulatory conference, where the SEC came to ask questions and left without answers. She had not gotten here by being sentimental. She had gotten here by being right, fast, and decisive, and right now the evidence in front of her pointed in one direction and one direction only. What she did not do, what she would spend months wishing she had done, was stop. Stop and ask one question, just one. What if Martin was wrong? What if the evidence was incomplete? What if the man she was about to destroy had a side of the story she had not heard? She did not ask because asking would have meant doubt, and doubt was the one thing Catherine Mercer had trained herself to eliminate. Doubt was weakness. Doubt was hesitation. Doubt was the crack in the wall that lets the water in, and Catherine had sealed every crack in her professional life with 22 years of certainty. Call him back up here tonight. I want this handled before the holiday. I don't want it leaking to the press. Martin stood. I'll have security bring him. Martin, he turned at the door. This is the right call. He looked at her with absolute certainty, the same certainty she carried, the mirror she could not see. This is the only call. So they brought Ethan up from the parking garage where he had been heading to his car to drive to the apartment where Marta Collins, the college student who lived 2 floors above him and watched Sophie when Ethan worked late, had already texted that Sophie was asking when he was coming home. They brought him up and they sat him down and they handed him a piece of paper that erased 8 years of work and a reputation he had spent a lifetime building, And they did it on Christmas Eve, while his daughter sat outside with a candy cane and the holiday music played through the speakers, like a soundtrack written by someone with a cruel sense of humor. He signed, he walked out, he took his daughter's hand, and then they were on the sidewalk in the snow, two figures against the lit-up city, one carrying a box and the other carrying a candy cane. And the distance between what had just happened and what should have happened was $40 million and a lie told by a man in a good suit. Daddy, can we still make cookies tonight? Ethan looked down at Sophie, snow in her hair, the red coat bright against the gray sidewalk, the candy cane clutched like a talisman against the cold. And despite everything, despite the rage that was building in his chest like a fire, he could not put out the injustice that tasted like metal on his tongue, the fear of what tomorrow would bring, and the day after that, and every day after that, he smiled. Because his daughter had asked him a question, and the answer was the only thing that mattered. Yeah, we're still making cookies. They took the subway together, the Q train at 10:15 on Christmas Eve, rattling through the tunnel under the East River toward Astoria, surrounded by the last commuters and the early revelers, in the particular exhaustion of a city that never stops moving, even on the night the rest of the country slows down. Sophie leaned against his shoulder and fell asleep before they reached their stop, and Ethan carried her up the stairs and through the cold streets to their building and up 3 flights to the apartment that was everything he could afford and everything that mattered. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that looked out at a brick wall, a radiator that clanked like it was holding a grudge against the cold, and in the corner of the living room, a Christmas tree that was barely 4 feet tall, decorated with ornaments Sophie had made at school, paper snowflakes with uneven edges, glitter stars that shed sparkles onto the carpet, a lopsided angel on top made from a toilet paper roll, and cotton balls, and a piece of gold ribbon that Grace had saved from a birthday present the year before she got sick. It was not the kind of tree that appeared in magazine photographs or department store windows. It was the kind of tree that a man with no money and a daughter who believed in magic could afford, and it was home. He put Sophie to bed at 10, read her the same Christmas story she asked for it every year, the one about the Velveteen Rabbit, the one Grace used to read, the one where love makes things real. Watched her eyes get heavy, pulled the blanket up to her chin. Daddy? Yeah. Are you Sayed? He brushed the hair from her face. The gesture was automatic, practiced the muscle memory of 2 years of doing everything alone. I'm fine, sweetheart. You don't look fine. He kissed her forehead. Grown-ups have big feelings sometimes, but I'm okay, I promise. She studied him with those dark eyes that missed nothing. Then she nodded the way children nod when they have decided to believe something they know is not entirely true because the alternative is too frightening to hold. I love you, Daddy. I love you more. She closed her eyes. Within minutes she was asleep, and the apartment was quiet except for the radiator, and the distant sound of a television murmuring through the thin wall from the neighbor's apartment, playing something that sounded like It's a Wonderful Life, which struck Ethan as either perfect or obscene, depending on how you looked at it. He went to the kitchen. He sat down at the table, the same table where Sophie had set 2 plates and 2 glasses and 2 napkins folded into triangles that evening, the way Grace used to do it, the ritual that Sophie maintained every night, because it was the last thread connecting her daily life to the mother she was already beginning to forget, and he opened his laptop. Everything was there. Every email he had sent to Martin Keene between September and December. 47 of them. 12 risk assessment reports documenting the overnight trades. 6 internal memos requesting review. 3 formal requests for an independent audit of the trading activity, all addressed to Martin Keene, all time-stamped and logged by the company's email server, all ignored. And separately locked in the fireproof box in the closet, the thumb drive containing Kevin Marshall's server logs. 18 entries showing Martin Keene's administrator credentials accessing the trading system in the dead of night while the building slept. Ethan closed the laptop. He sat in the silence of the kitchen, and he thought about what to do. He thought about calling a lawyer. He thought about going to the press. He thought about walking back into that building on the morning of December 26th and laying every piece of evidence on the conference table in front of the entire board of directors and watching Martin Keene's face change from composed to caught. He thought about justice, and he thought about vindication, and he thought about the particular satisfaction of being proved right in a world that had just told him he was wrong. And then he thought about Sophie. She was 8 years old, and she had already lost her mother. She had already learned what it meant to come home to a house where one chair at the table was empty, and one toothbrush in the bathroom was gone, and one voice that used to sing in the kitchen would never sing again. She had learned these things, and she had survived them because her father was present, because every morning he made her breakfast, and every afternoon he picked her up from school, and every evening he sat with her and read to her and helped her with her homework and told her that everything was going to be all right. She needed him. Not in the abstract, not in the way that children need their parents, the way everyone needs oxygen. Specifically, concretely, she needed him functional and stable and not consumed by a legal battle that could take years and drain every resource he had and leave him hollow and furious and absent in all the ways that matter most. So Ethan made a decision. He would be patient. He would keep his evidence safe. He would not make a move until the moment was right and the ground beneath his feet was solid. Because the truth has a quality that lies do not. It does not need permission. It does not expire. And sooner or later, it finds a way out. He picked up his phone and called Pittsburgh. It was late after 11, but Henry Caldwell was a man who had spent 40 years answering emergency calls at all hours, and the habit had never left him. He picked up on the third ring. "Merry Christmas, son." The sound of his father's voice, rough, warmed the voice of a man who had worked with his hands his entire life and had never once apologized for it, nearly broke Ethan open. He pressed the phone against his ear and closed his eyes. "Dad, they fired me." Henry did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "Everything will be okay." He did not fill the silence with platitudes or sympathy or the kind of empty reassurance that people offer when they do not know what else to do. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent 7 decades learning that the only question worth asking is the one that gets to the center. "Did you do right?" "I did everything right." "Then you stand straight. They can take your job, Ethan. They can't take what you know is true. I wired buildings for 40 years. Nobody ever saw what I did. It was behind walls, under floors, in ceilings nobody looked at. But every time somebody flipped a light switch, they used what I built. That's what you did. You built something nobody sees. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't matter." Ethan pressed his hand against his eyes. The kitchen light buzzed overhead. Through the wall, the neighbor's television played on. Outside the window, snow was still falling on Astoria, covering the fire escapes and the parked cars and the small concrete yard behind the building where Sophie liked to draw with chalk in the summer. "Thanks, Dad. You call me if you need anything, and you tell Sophie her grandpa says Merry Christmas." "I will." "And Ethan." "Yeah, that little girl is watching everything you do. She's watching how you handle this. What you show her right now is what she'll carry for the rest of her life. So you show her what it looks like when a man gets knocked down and stands back up. That's worth more than any job." The call ended. Ethan sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The radiator clanked. The Christmas tree lights blinked in the living room, red and green and white, the cheap strings Sophie had picked out at the dollar store because she said they looked like magic. He thought about Henry Caldwell crawling through a ceiling cavity in the dark, making sure the circuits were clean and the connections were solid, and the lights in the operating room would come on when someone needed them. Nobody knew his name. Nobody put his picture on a wall. But the lights came on. Ethan stood up. He walked to the closet and checked the fireproof box. The thumb drive was there. The evidence was intact. He walked back to the kitchen and looked at the laptop sitting on the table, the screen dark 47 emails sleeping inside it like ammunition waiting for a war he had not yet decided to fight. He turned off the kitchen light. He walked past the Christmas tree and adjusted the lopsided angel on top. It had been tilting left all week, and Sophie kept straightening it, and it kept tilting back, a small recurring battle between an 8-year-old's optimism and gravity. He went to Sophie's room and sat in the chair beside her bed. She was asleep on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, her breathing slow and even. The red coat hung on the back of her door. Her school backpack sat on the floor, half unzipped, a math worksheet poking out of the top. He watched her sleep, and he made himself a promise that he would not break. He would not let this destroy what they had built. He would not let Martin Keene's lie become the story of their lives. He would be patient, and he would be strategic, and he would wait for the moment when the truth could do what lies could not survive the light. Outside, the snow kept falling on Queens. The city did not notice. Crestline Capital did not care. The man who framed him was probably in his penthouse right now, somewhere on the Upper East Side or overlooking Central Park, pouring himself a glass of scotch and smiling at the skyline because, as far as Martin Keene knew, it was over. The scapegoat was gone. The trail was clean. The CEO believed the story. The consulting firm would confirm what Martin had carefully arranged for them to find. The board would be satisfied. The regulators would not ask a single question. Martin Keene raised his glass in a room Ethan Caldwell would never see, and he drank to the silence of a man he thought he had buried. But he did not know that in a cramped apartment in Astoria, a thumb drive sat in a fireproof box behind baby clothes. He did not know that a copy of his own server credentials was logged and documented and waiting. He did not know that in a lawyer's office on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, a lawyer Ethan had not yet called a meeting that had not yet happened, a case that had not yet been built. A sealed envelope would soon hold everything Martin Keene had done between September and December, preserved in triplicate, witnessed and notarized beyond his reach. And he certainly did not know that in 6 weeks, the woman he reported to the woman he had manipulated into destroying an innocent man's career on Christmas Eve would meet that same man on a frozen highway in the middle of the night. And that meeting would change everything. But that was still 6 weeks away. Tonight was Christmas Eve. And in a small apartment in Queens, Ethan Caldwell sat beside his sleeping daughter and listened to the radiator clank and the snow fall and the silence of a city that had no idea what was coming. His hands were not shaking. His jaw was set. His mind was already working, sorting the evidence, planning the sequence, calculating the timeline, the way his father had taught him to read a circuit diagram before picking up a single tool. He looked at Sophie one more time. Then he whispered something into the dark room, not for her, not for anyone, just for himself. The kind of thing a man says when he has been stripped of everything except the one thing that cannot be taken. Evidence doesn't die just because you fire the man holding it. He sat there until midnight. Then he stood, pulled the blanket up over Sophie's shoulder, and walked to the kitchen to make a list of everything he was going to need. A lawyer, copies, a timeline, patience. And the one thing that Henry Caldwell had given him that no one at Crestline Capital had ever understood or valued or even noticed, the knowledge of what it means to build something in the dark and trust that when the time comes, the lights will come on. Christmas morning arrived the way it always does in a home where the money is tight and the love is not quietly with small gifts and large feelings. Sophie woke at 6:30 and padded into the living room in her pajamas and found the 3 presents Ethan had wrapped in newspaper because wrapping paper was $4 a roll and the newspaper was free. A coloring book with a set of good colored pencils, not the cheap kind that broke when you pressed too hard, a pair of fuzzy socks with cats on them, and a framed photograph of Grace and Sophie at Coney Island the summer before Grace got sick, both of them laughing, the ocean behind them, the sun catching Grace's hair. Sophie held the photograph for a long time. She did not cry. She ran her finger along the edge of the frame and looked at her mother's face, and then she looked up at Ethan with an expression that was too old for 8 years, an expression that said she understood something about loss that most adults spend their whole lives trying to articulate. She looks happy. She was happy. That was one of the best days. Sophie set the photograph on the shelf next to the Christmas tree where the angel could see it. Then she picked up the coloring book and the pencils and sat down on the floor and began to draw, and Ethan stood in the doorway of the kitchen with a coffee mug in his hand and watched her and felt the 2 things he always felt when he looked at his daughter: gratitude that she existed and terror that he might not be enough. They made the cookies that afternoon, sugar cookies with red and green sprinkles. The recipe Grace had used, written in Grace's handwriting on an index card that was stained with butter and flour and kept in a drawer with the other things Ethan could not bring himself to throw away. Sophie measured the sugar. Ethan cracked the eggs. They worked in the small kitchen with the window that looked at a brick wall and the oven that ran 15 degrees hot and the radio that did not work. And for a few hours, the apartment smelled like something other than worry, and the world felt like it was the right size. After dinner, macaroni and cheese from a box, the meal that Sophie requested most often, and Ethan made without complaint because it cost 97 cents, and she ate every bite. Sophie asked a question that landed like a blow. "Daddy, did they fire you?" He set down his fork. The macaroni went cold on his plate. Why would you ask that? Because at school, Tyler's dad got fired. And Tyler said his dad was really sad and watched TV all day. Ethan looked at his daughter across the table and he understood that the conversation he had been hoping to delay had arrived whether he was ready for it or not. I'm not going to watch TV all day. Promise, promise. Okay. She picked up her fork. Because I need you to help me with math. Marta doesn't know how to do the hard ones. Ethan laughed. It was the first real laugh he had produced in days. Not a performance, not the careful imitation of happiness he assembled every morning for Sophie's benefit, but the actual involuntary sound of something inside him, responding to the absurd, wonderful, relentless logic of an 8-year-old who had just reduced his entire crisis to a question of arithmetic tutoring. It did not fix anything, but it reminded him that some things still worked the way they were supposed to. That night, after Sophie fell asleep, Ethan sat at his laptop again. He organized every piece of evidence he possessed into a single encrypted folder. 47 emails, 12 risk assessment reports, 6 internal memos, 3 formal audit requests, all addressed to Martin Keene, all acknowledged by the company's email server, all ignored, and in the closet the thumb drive. 18 server log entries showing Martin Keene's credentials accessing the trading terminals in the dead of night. He opened a blank document and began writing a timeline. September 8th, first anomalous trade detected. September 14th, first email sent to Martin Keene. September 21st, second anomalous trade. October 3rd, second email. And on it went date after date, trade after trade, email after email, a catalog of diligence that Martin Keene had read and dismissed and then tried to erase. 47 warnings sent by a man who was doing his job. 47 warnings received by a man who was committing the crime. Ethan saved the document and closed the laptop. He looked at the clock. It was 2 in the morning on December 26. Christmas was over. The cookies were in a tin on the counter. The photograph of Grace and Sophie stood on the shelf. The angel on the tree had tilted left again. He stood up and walked to the window. Snow was still falling lighter now, the kind of snow that comes at the end of a storm when the clouds are almost spent. The street below was empty. The fire escapes were white. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded the sound of a city that never sleeps, carrying on with its endless inventory of emergencies and indifferences. Ethan pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. He thought about Martin Keene in his penthouse, warm and confident, and certain that the problem had been solved. He thought about Catherine Mercer in her corner office, satisfied that she had handled a crisis efficiently. And he thought about what James Brennan would soon confirm, that the trades had never made strategic sense, because they were not investments at all, but the desperate mathematics of an addict trying to win back what the tables had taken using someone else's money, because his own was already gone. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the snow falling on Astoria, on the rooftops, in the cars, and the basketball court behind the school where Sophie played at recess, and he made a second promise to himself. He would find a lawyer, he would build his case, he would file with the SEC, and he would do it the right way through channels with evidence patiently and methodically, because that was how his father had taught him to work, and that was the only way he knew. But he would not do it tonight. Tonight he would go to bed, and tomorrow he would start. He checked the fireproof box one more time. The thumb drive was there. He checked the laptop. The files were encrypted. He walked to Sophie's room and stood in the doorway watching the rise and fall of her breathing. Under the blanket, the red coat hanging on the door, the math worksheet still poking out of the backpack. Then he went to bed and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the radiator fight the cold. And somewhere in the building, a pipe groaned, and somewhere on the street, a car door closed, and somewhere across the river in a glass tower that would still be standing in the morning of 47 emails sat in a server, waiting for someone to find them. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon. 3 days after Christmas, Ethan Caldwell stood at a counter in the Queens Workforce Center on Jamaica Avenue and handed his paperwork to a woman whose expression suggested she had processed 10,000 identical forms and expected 10,000 more. She looked at the documents. She looked at him. Crestline Capital, 8 years, reason for separation. The termination letter said performance-related dismissal. Those were the words Martin Keene had chosen clean clinical, the kind of language that follows a man from one job application to the next, like a scar he cannot cover with a better shirt. Every hiring manager who called Crestline for a reference would hear those words, and the conversation would end. The resume would go in the trash. The door would close before Ethan ever got close enough to knock. Any severance, the woman asked. 60 days. You'll receive a determination letter in 7 to 10 business days. If your former employer contests the claim, there will be a hearing. He thanked her. He walked out into the cold. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket, a text from James Brennan. 2 words, call me. Ethan called from the subway platform, one hand cupping the phone against the roar of an incoming train. James picked up immediately, his voice low, the background noise suggesting he was calling from inside the building. They're cleaning house, Ethan. Catherine brought in an outside consulting firm 2 days ago, restructuring the entire risk management division. Everyone on your old team got reassigned or let go. Janet, Paul, Rita from compliance. They're calling it budget cuts tied to the loss, but it doesn't feel like budget cuts. It feels like they're getting rid of anyone who might ask questions. The train screamed past. Ethan pressed the phone harder against his ear. They're covering their tracks. That's what it looks like. And there's more. Martin Keene has been in private meetings with Catherine every day since you left. Whatever story he's telling her, she's buying it. He's not just protecting himself anymore. He's building a wall. If you come forward now, it's your word against the vice president of finance. And right now, you're the guy who got fired for cause. And the train stopped. The doors opened. People pushed past in both directions, carrying grocery bags and strollers in the particular exhaustion of the week between Christmas and New Year's, when the city runs on half speed and full anxiety. So what do I do? James was quiet for a beat. Be smart. You've got a daughter to think about. Don't go to war until you know you can win. The words landed harder than James probably intended, because they were true, and because the truth sometimes sounds exactly like the thing you don't want to hear. And Ethan, one more thing. James's voice dropped lower. I've been hearing something. From a guy I know in accounting. Martin's been going to Atlantic City on weekends. Has been for months. Not company trips. Personal. Alone. If he's gambling with his own money and losing, then those 40 million in trades weren't investment errors. They were cover. He was using company funds to dig himself out of a hole. The train doors chimed. Ethan stepped on and found a seat between a woman carrying 2 bags of groceries and a teenager whose headphones leaked bass like a second heartbeat. He stared at his reflection in the dark window as the tunnel swallowed the car and the light flickered and the stations blurred past. Gambling. That was the piece he had not seen. The trades had never made strategic sense. The positions were too aggressive, the timing too erratic, the exposure too large for any rational investment thesis. But they made perfect sense as the desperate mathematics of an addict trying to win back what the tables had taken, doubling down with someone else's money, because his own was already gone. He rode the train home in silence. When he got to the apartment, Sophie was at the kitchen table drawing with crayons. Marta Collins, who had been watching her, was heating soup on the stove. Sophie looked up. Daddy, I drew our apartment. See, that's the window. That's the Christmas tree. That's you. He looked at the drawing. The figure she had drawn of him was smiling. A wide, uncomplicated smile, the kind that belonged to the version of her father that Sophie needed to believe in, the version that did not sit at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at encrypted files and wondering how a man with a mortgage and a child and a dead wife was supposed to fight a vice president and with 12 years of institutional armor. That's really good, Soph. Marta grabbed her coat. She was a junior at Queens College, reliable and kind, the sort of person who charged half what a professional sitter would because she lived upstairs and because Sophie had once made her a friendship bracelet and Marta had worn it every day since. She was great today. Ate lunch, did her reading. She asked me 3 times when you were coming home. After Marta left, Ethan heated his own bowl of soup and sat across from Sophie. She was still drawing, adding a sun to the picture, even though the window in their apartment faced a brick wall, and the sun had not been visible from that kitchen since the building next door went up in 1987. Daddy, are you going to work tomorrow? Not tomorrow, no. How come? My job is changing a little. I'm figuring some things out. Sophie put down her crayon. Her dark eyes settled on his face with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with surveillance, the quiet, constant monitoring of a child who has already lost one parent and is determined not to be surprised by the loss of another. Did they fire you? He had rehearsed a dozen versions of this conversation in his head, and none of them had started this directly. Why would you ask that? Tyler at school. His dad got fired. Tyler said his dad was really sad and watched TV all day, and then they had to move. Ethan set down his spoon. I'm not going to watch TV all day, and we're not moving. Promise, promise. She picked up her crayon again, apparently satisfied by the contractual weight of the word. Good, because I need you to help me with the hard math, and I like our apartment. He cleaned up the dishes after she went back to drawing. He stood at the sink with the hot water running and his hands gripping the edge of the counter, and he let himself feel for exactly 30 seconds the full weight of what had been done to him. The humiliation, the injustice, the knowledge that somewhere in a glass tower across the river, a man who had committed $40 million worth of fraud was sleeping soundly because the system he had exploited was the same system that had chewed up and discarded the one person who tried to stop him. Then Ethan turned off the water, dried his hands, and went to find a lawyer. Frank Torelli's office occupied the second floor of a narrow building on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, sandwiched between a Dominican bakery and a shop that repaired vacuum cleaners. The stairway smelled like coffee and old carpet. The door at the top had a frosted glass panel with gold lettering that read, Torelli and Associates, though as far as Ethan could tell, there were no associates, just Frank, a desk, a filing cabinet the size of a refrigerator, and a window that looked out at the elevated tracks of the subway. Frank himself was 63 years old, built like a man who had played offensive line in college and never entirely stopped eating, as though he still needed the calories. Silver hair, thick hands, a handshake that communicated competence through sheer compression. James Brennan had recommended him with 3 words he doesn't scare. Ethan sat across from him and talked for 45 minutes without interruption. He laid out everything, the trades, the timestamps, the emails, the server logs from Kevin Marshall, the termination on Christmas Eve. Frank listened with his chair tilted back and a pen balanced between his fingers, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Ethan's head, the posture of a man who was not just hearing a story, but building a structure inside his mind, testing the load-bearing walls, checking the foundation. When Ethan finished, Frank leaned forward. The chair creaked. The pen tapped the desk twice. Let me make sure I understand this. You identified a $40 million fraud. You reported it to the person committing the fraud. He buried your reports. Then he framed you for the loss and got the CEO to fire you on Christmas Eve. And the CEO didn't verify any of this before she signed the termination. She took Martin's word. She didn't ask me a single question about my reports. She didn't check the server logs. She didn't ask whether I'd raised concerns. She just signed. Frank's pen tapped again. Catherine Mercer has a reputation. Smart, ruthless, not the kind of person who makes sloppy decisions. She made one this time. Yeah, she did, and that's going to matter. Frank leaned in and his voice shifted from assessment to strategy, the way a mechanic's tone changes when he stops diagnosing and starts explaining what the repair is going to cost. Here's the thing, Ethan, you've got a strong case, possibly very strong, but right now Crestline doesn't know you have this evidence. They think you're a fired analyst licking his wounds. The minute you file a whistleblower complaint, that changes. Martin Keene will know you're coming. And a man who committed $40 million in fraud and framed a colleague to cover it is not going to sit still while you expose him. What are you saying? I'm saying we file with the SEC first. Quietly, we submit the server logs, the emails, everything. We let the regulators start their own investigation. Once the feds are involved, Crestline can't touch you without it looking like retaliation. That's your shield. How long? Could be weeks, could be months. The SEC doesn't move fast, but they move hard. Ethan rubbed his face. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed. Through the window, the subway rattled past on the elevated track, shaking the glass in its frame. I've got an 8-year-old Frank. I'm running on unemployment and a 60-day severance that's already half gone. I don't have months. Frank looked at him across the desk, and something in the older man's expression shifted, not softness exactly, but recognition. The look of a man who had sat across from enough desperate people to know the difference between someone seeking revenge and someone seeking survival. I understand that, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Whistleblower cases are brutal. They take time. They take endurance. But the evidence you have is real. Timestamps don't lie. Server logs don't lie. And when the SEC sees that a vice president of finance used his own credentials to execute unauthorized trades and then blamed a subordinate, they are going to take that very seriously. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. My daughter asked me the other day if I got fired. She's 8 years old, Frank, and she already knows something is wrong. I can't let this define us. I can't let her grow up thinking her father just took it, that he let someone destroy his life and walked away. Frank's pen stopped moving. He set it down on the desk and folded his hands. Then we fight. Then we fight. They spent the next 3 hours building the case file. Frank made 2 copies of the thumb drive. One went into his office safe. The other went into a sealed envelope deposited at his attorney's trust account at a bank on Court Street. The emails were printed, time-stamped, and organized into a binder that Frank locked in his filing cabinet. When they finished, Frank walked Ethan to the door. One more thing. Don't contact anyone at Crestline. Not Catherine, not Martin, not anyone. Let them think you've moved on. The quieter you are, the louder this is going to be when it lands. Ethan walked out onto Atlantic Avenue. January cold hit him like a wall. He pulled his coat tighter and headed for the subway. On the train home, he thought about Martin Keene, the memorial service, the handshake, the words that had meant nothing and cost nothing and concealed everything. My door is open. And when Ethan had walked through that door with evidence of fraud, Martin had smiled, taken the reports, and buried them so deep that by the time Catherine Mercer asked what happened, the only story she heard was the one Martin wanted her to tell. The betrayal was the part that burned the most, not the firing, not the financial ruin closing in like water rising in a basement. The betrayal, the specific, personal, calculated cruelty of a man who had shaken his hand at his wife's memorial and then used his grief as a weapon. Mid-January arrived with a phone call Ethan did not expect. He was at the Queens Public Library using the free Wi-Fi to send out another batch of job applications. He had lost count somewhere around 60, all of them disappearing into the same silence when his phone vibrated with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Telemarketers had been calling 3 times a day, and he had started letting everything go to voicemail. But something made him pick up. Mr. Caldwell, my name is Tom Hadley. I'm an investigative reporter with the Financial Times. I'm working on a story about Crestline Capital, and I believe you may have information that would be valuable to my reporting. Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. The library was quiet around him, the hush of a public space where people come to read and think, and in Ethan's case, to apply for jobs on a borrowed internet connection because the one in his apartment had been canceled 3 weeks ago. Tom Hadley, 48 years old from the sound of his voice. The kind of reporter who introduced himself by full name and affiliation, which meant he was serious. The Financial Times didn't assign investigative pieces to people who were fishing. If Hadley was calling, he already had something. I understand you were terminated in December. I have a source inside Crestline, not you, someone else who believes there are significant financial irregularities in the firm's trading operations. I'm trying to verify certain details, and your perspective would be extremely helpful. Every instinct Ethan had told him to talk. To open his mouth and let it pour out the trades, the timestamps, the 47 emails, the Christmas Eve termination while his daughter sat in the lobby with a candy cane. He wanted someone to know. He wanted someone with a platform and a readership to stand up and say what had happened and name the man who did it. But he heard Frank Torelli's voice in his head, steady and unequivocal. SEC first. If the press runs this before the regulators have the file, Martin gets the time to destroy evidence and you lose your legal shield. I can't talk to you right now, Mr. Hadley. I'm sorry. A pause. I understand, but if you change your mind, you have my number. And Mr. Caldwell, I'm not going away. This story is going to come out one way or another. The call ended. Ethan sat in the library for a long time staring at his phone. Then he called Frank Torelli and told him about the reporter. Good. That means someone else inside the building is suspicious. That's good for us. But you were right not to talk to him. Let the SEC work. When the time comes, the press will have plenty to write about. 2 weeks later, James Brennan texted Crestline sent a cease and desist letter to the Financial Times. Threatened to sue Hadley for defamation. He's been forced to pause the investigation. Martin Keene was not just covering his tracks. He was paving over them with lawyers and threats and the full institutional weight of a company that had spent 2 decades building a reputation it would now deploy as a weapon against anyone who tried to look too closely. The reporter had been silenced. The colleagues who might have spoken up had been reassigned or fired. The compliance department had been gutted. Every avenue of exposure was being methodically sealed, and Ethan was watching it happen from a public library in Queens with an unemployment check that covered 2/3 of his rent and a daughter who needed new shoes. The money ran out faster than he had calculated. Severance covered January. Unemployment covered part of February. But the math was merciless. Rent, utilities, groceries. Sophie's school supplies. Marta's modest fee, the copay on Sophie's dental checkup that Ethan had postponed twice and could not postpone again. He clipped coupons for the first time in his life. He found a food bank 3 blocks from Sophie's school and went there on a Tuesday morning wearing a hat pulled low, carrying a shame he knew was irrational, but felt anyway the particular humiliation of a man who had always provided now standing in a line to receive. The woman behind the counter handed him 2 bags and told him, "Merry belated Christmas." He thanked her and walked home carrying canned vegetables and pasta and a jar of peanut butter, and he told himself this was temporary. The SEC was reviewing his case. Frank Torelli was building his file. Justice was coming. But justice does not pay rent, and the landlord's notice arrived on January 23rd. 30 days to catch up or face eviction proceedings. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and stared at the paper for a long time, the numbers running through his head like a circuit diagram with too many broken connections. Frank Torelli filed a hardship stay the next morning, buying 60 additional days on the grounds that Ethan was a cooperating witness in a pending federal investigation, a legal maneuver that did not eliminate the debt, but pushed it far enough into the future that Ethan could breathe. Sophie walked in while the notice was still on the table. She looked at it the way she always looked at documents her father left in plain sight, with the clear, undeceived gaze of a girl who had spent 2 years watching him pretend everything was fine and had learned to measure the distance between his words and his face. "Just a letter from the building," he said before she could ask. "Nothing important." She did not challenge him. She went to the counter and poured herself a glass of water and sat down and began her homework, and the silence between them was full of the things she would not ask and the things he would not say. Ethan found the warehouse job at the end of January, a distribution center in Brooklyn, night shift 10 at night to 6 in the morning, stacking pallets and scanning barcodes minimum wage. The work was physical and repetitive and paid less in a week than he used to earn in a day, but combined with unemployment, it covered the gap the hardship stay had created, and it gave him something he had not realized: he needed a reason to leave the apartment at night instead of sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a laptop full of evidence he could not yet use. The commute took him across the Kosciuszko Bridge every night in a truck he had bought for $900 from a lot in Maspeth, an old Ford with a dented fender and a heater that worked when it felt like it, and a radio that had stopped receiving signals sometime during the previous administration. He drove it across the bridge at 10 o'clock on winter nights with the East River black below him and the city lights smeared across the windshield and the cold coming through gaps in the door seals. The warehouse manager, a stocky man named Davis, who wore a Mets cap and communicated primarily through grunts, noticed within the first week that Ethan was different from the usual night shift hires. By the end of the second week, Ethan had reorganized the packing system for the eastern loading bay, cutting 20 minutes off each shift's processing time by rearranging the staging sequence so that the most frequently shipped items were closest to the dock doors. Davis watched him do it with the expression of a man who has just seen someone solve a problem he didn't know he had. "You're the best analyst who's ever stacked boxes in my warehouse," Davis said on Ethan's third Friday, which was the closest thing to a compliment the man had ever produced. Ethan laughed a real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and works upward, the kind he had not heard from himself in weeks. Every morning he drove home across the bridge at 6:15. He showered. He made Sophie's breakfast. He walked her to school at 8:15. He came home and slept from 9 to 2. He picked her up at 3:15. He helped with homework. He made dinner. He put her to bed. and then he drove back across the bridge to stack boxes until dawn. Sophie noticed the schedule change but did not interrogate it. She adapted. She made her own breakfast on the mornings when Ethan overslept. She packed her own lunch. She did her homework without being asked. She was 8 years old and she was carrying a weight that no child should carry, and she was carrying it with the quiet competence of a girl who had decided that the best way to help her father was to need him as little as possible, which was its own kind of heartbreak, the kind that doesn't make noise. The night Catherine Mercer's Mercedes died was the first week of February, roughly 6 weeks after Christmas Eve. Ethan was driving home from the warehouse at 11 o'clock, the truck rattling across the Kosciuszko Bridge in wind that cut through the door seals like a blade. The temperature gauge on the dashboard, one of the few instruments that still worked, read 11 degrees below zero. The road was empty except for the occasional semi and the distant red smear of taillights heading toward Staten Island. He saw the car on the shoulder from a quarter-mile away. Dark shape, no hazard lights, no movement. The instinct to keep driving was strong. It was late, it was cold. The bridge was no place to stop, but Henry Caldwell had also taught his son that you do not pass a stranded vehicle in winter without checking, because the difference between a minor inconvenience and a death is sometimes nothing more than 20 minutes of exposure. Ethan pulled the truck onto the shoulder behind the Mercedes and killed the engine. The car was a late model S-Class, the kind of vehicle that cost more than Ethan's apartment was worth. The windows were dark. He zipped his jacket and walked to the driver's side and knocked on the glass. The window lowered 2 inches, releasing a thin plume of breath into the frozen air. A woman's voice, controlled but tight. "I've called for assistance. They're on their way." "How long ago?" 20 minutes. "In this cold, that's a long wait. Pop the hood. Let me take a look." "That's not necessary." He could see her through the gap, a silhouette rigid, the posture of someone who was accustomed to handling problems by issuing instructions and was not prepared for a situation where the instructions had no one to reach. Her phone, he guessed, was dead or dying. The heat was off because the engine was off. In another 20 minutes, the cold would move from uncomfortable to dangerous. "Ma'am, it's 11 degrees. Your engine's dead, which means your heat's dead. I can help or I can stand here and argue, but either way, you're getting colder." A pause. Then the hood release clicked. He walked to the front of the car. The diagnosis took 30 seconds, alternator, failure, battery drained. He had seen it 100 times, the kind of problem that Henry Caldwell could fix in a driveway with a wrench and a replacement part from the auto supply store on Penn Avenue. Out here in the dark on a frozen bridge, the fix was simpler. Jump it and drive straight to a shop before the battery died again. He went back to the window. "Alternator's gone. Battery's dead. I can jump it, but you'll need to drive straight to a service station. Kill the engine and it won't start again. You can jump-start a Mercedes." Something in his chest tightened. Not offense exactly, but the specific, weary recognition of a man who has spent his entire life being underestimated by people who believe that the ability to fix things and the ability to understand things are distributed along class lines. A battery is a battery. Doesn't matter what name's on the hood. He pulled his truck forward and connected the cables. 5 minutes. The Mercedes engine turned over with a sound like relief, the dashboard lighting up, the heat rushing through the vents, the car returning to life the way machines do when someone who knows what they are doing puts their hands on the problem. Catherine Mercer stepped out of the car. She had left the office late after a meeting that ran past 9. Her driver had called in sick that afternoon. Her assistant had already gone home. Catherine, who controlled every variable of her life, because control was the thing she trusted most, had decided to drive herself. 20 minutes, she told herself. She did not need anyone. In the combined headlights of both vehicles, his battered Ford and her $90,000 sedan, he saw her face clearly for the first time since Christmas Eve. And she saw his. The recognition was immediate and mutual. Her expression went through 3 stages in less than a second: confusion, comprehension, and something he had not expected. Something that looked like it might have been shame, though it disappeared so quickly he could not be certain it had been there at all. He was already disconnecting the cables, winding them back into a loop with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this particular task since he was 15 years old, and his father had shown him how. He did not speak. He did not stop moving. He closed her hood and walked back toward his truck. "Ethan." He stopped. His back was to her. The wind cut between them sharp enough to make his eyes water. A semi blasted past in the left lane, shaking both vehicles. "You know who I am," she said. He turned around. "I knew who you were the moment I pulled over." The words hung in the frozen air between them like something solid, something with weight. She stood in her $1,200 coat on the shoulder of Interstate 278, with the Manhattan skyline glowing in the distance behind her, and the cold turning her breath into ghosts, and she asked the only question that mattered. "Then why did you stop?" He looked at her. His face was calm, not angry, not bitter, not performing forgiveness or staging a moral victory or making a point about the kind of man he was. Just steady. The expression of a man who had been through the worst thing that could happen to him in a parking garage on Christmas Eve and had come out the other side with nothing left to prove and no interest in proving it. "Because you needed help." 4 words. And then he turned, walked to his truck, got in, and pulled away. His taillights disappeared into the dark, and Catherine Mercer stood on the shoulder of a frozen highway and felt something shift inside her chest. Not dramatically, not with the clean certainty of a revelation, but slowly the way a crack starts in a foundation. A hairline. Almost invisible, but structural. She drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the hum of the engine and the darkness of the highway and the echo of a voice that had no anger in it, only truth. She parked in her building's garage on the Upper East Side and sat in the car with the engine running. Her hands were trembling. Not from the cold the heat had been blasting for 20 minutes. From something else. Something she had spent 22 years engineering herself not to feel. She went upstairs. She poured a glass of wine. She sat at her kitchen table, and for the first time she allowed herself to think about what she had done. The way he had looked at her in her office that night. Not with rage. Not with the theatrical indignation of a man who knew he was guilty and was performing innocence. With certainty. The look of a man who knew he was telling the truth and knew it didn't matter. She had seen that look once before early in her career. A colleague, a junior analyst, blamed for a trading error that wasn't his. He tried to explain. The partners wouldn't listen. He was let go. 2 months later, the real culprit was caught. But the damage was done. The man had lost his apartment, his wife had left, he moved back to Ohio. Catherine had watched it happen, and she had told herself she would never be that kind of leader. She would never make a decision without verifying the evidence. She would never sacrifice someone because it was expedient. And then she became exactly that. Her ex-husband's voice drifted through her memory, the words he had thrown at her during the last argument of their marriage 15 years ago. "You love control more than you love people." She had dismissed it then as the wounded complaint of a man who could not keep up with her ambition. She was not sure anymore. But Catherine Mercer did not act, not that night. She pushed it down the doubt, the crack, the 4 words on the highway, because pushing things down was how she functioned. Admitting she had been wrong about Martin Keene meant admitting she had destroyed an innocent man's career and livelihood and reputation, and that was a weight Catherine Mercer was not yet prepared to lift. She went to bed. She did not sleep. She had not slept more than 3 hours a night since Christmas Eve, and she had told herself it was the stress of the restructuring, the board's questions, the financial exposure, the media inquiries. She had told herself everything except the truth, which was that somewhere beneath the steel and the discipline and the 22 years of never doubting her own judgment, a woman was beginning to understand that the most dangerous lie she had ever believed was not the one Martin Keene had told her. It was the one she had told herself, that certainty was the same thing as being right. The Children's Winter Gala was held on the last Saturday in February at the Waldorf in a ballroom that cost more to rent for one evening than Ethan Caldwell would earn in 6 months of stacking pallets. Crestline Capital sponsored it every year, a charity event benefiting underprivileged youth in the 5 boroughs, open to the public through ticket sales attended by board members and investors and politicians, and the particular species of New York socialite who treats philanthropy as a networking opportunity with better lighting. There were ice sculptures. There was a string quartet. There was a children's craft area in the southeast corner where kids could paint and draw while their parents circulated through the room pretending to care about something other than being seen. Diane Brennan bought 2 tickets. She told James she wanted to take Sophie because the girl loved to draw and hadn't been to anything fancy since Grace died, and because Diane Brennan was the kind of woman who noticed when a child needed something her father couldn't afford to give her, and found a way to provide it without making anyone feel small. James mentioned it to Ethan on the phone carefully, the way men discuss kindness when they know the recipient might mistake it for charity. Diane wants to take Sophie to this gala thing. Kids area crafts free food. Sophie would love it. Nothing to do with the company. Public event. Ethan hesitated. The thought of his daughter inside a building funded by the people who had destroyed his career produced a physical reaction. A tightening in his chest, a taste like copper. But Sophie had been drawing on the same pad of paper for 3 weeks because he couldn't afford a new one, and the craft area at a gala would have supplies she had never touched. He said yes. What Ethan did not know was that Sophie had found his letter. He had written it the week before, sitting at the kitchen table after she fell asleep, a handwritten note addressed to Catherine Mercer, laying out in plain language what he had done and what had been done to him. 47 emails, 3 audit requests, server logs showing Martin Keene's credentials. He had intended to give it to Frank Torelli to send through legal channels. He had left it on the counter beside the coffee maker while he went to check on Sophie, and when he came back it was gone, slipped under a stack of schoolwork. He assumed he had moved it himself, the distracted gesture of a man running on 4 hours of sleep. Sophie had read it. She was 8, and she could read at a 5th grade level. Because Grace had started teaching her before kindergarten, those evenings on the couch with chapter books had taken root so deep that Sophie consumed written words the way other children consume cartoons. She read the letter and she understood enough of it to know that her father had sent warnings and nobody had listened, and the boss lady had fired him anyway. She folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her red coat because she had decided with the uncomplicated moral logic of a child who has not yet learned that adults make things complicated on purpose, that if she ever saw the boss lady, she would give it to her. Because her daddy said the truth matters, and if the truth was on a piece of paper, then the paper needed to go to the person who hadn't heard it yet. Ethan did not know any of this. He kissed Sophie goodbye at the door of the apartment, told Diane to call if anything came up, and went to bed because his shift at the warehouse started in 4 hours, and sleep was a resource he managed with the same ruthless efficiency he had once applied to risk assessments. The gala was crowded and bright and loud, in the way that rooms full of wealthy people are always loud, the volume of confidence, the acoustic signature of a class that has never had to whisper. Sophie held Diane's hand through the entrance and stared up at the chandeliers and the ice sculptures and the women in gowns and the men in tuxedos with the wide-eyed gravity of a child encountering a world she did not know existed. Diane led her to the craft area and set her up at a table with paints and brushes and paper that was thicker and wider than anything Sophie had ever used, and for an hour the girl was lost in color, painting a picture of a house with a red door and a yellow sun and a man standing in front of it who was smiling. Catherine Mercer moved through the gala the way she moved through every public event: handshakes, small talk, strategic laughter, the performance of warmth, by a woman whose actual temperature ran several degrees below what her smile suggested. She wore black. She carried a glass of champagne she barely touched. She had not slept more than 3 hours in a single night for 2 months, and the concealer under her eyes was doing work that no cosmetic was designed to sustain. She was walking past the children's area when a small voice stopped her. "Excuse me." Catherine looked down. A girl, red coat, dark blonde hair, eyes that were dark and serious and familiar in a way that made Catherine's stomach contract before her brain caught up with the recognition. "Are you the boss?" Catherine assembled her public expression, warm, approachable, the face she wore for cameras and donors and children she did not know. "I run the company. Yes. My daddy used to work here." The public expression held. The thing behind it shifted. "Oh, what's your daddy's name?" "Ethan Caldwell." The room did not actually go quiet. The string quartet kept playing. The conversations kept humming. The champagne kept flowing. But inside Catherine Mercer's chest, in the space where 22 years of certainty had built a structure she believed was unshakable, something fundamental moved. She knelt down. The floor was hard and cold through her dress, and she did not care. She knelt so that her eyes were level with Sophie's, because the child deserved that, and because some part of Catherine understood already that this conversation was going to matter more than every boardroom negotiation she had ever conducted. "You're Sophie." The girl tilted her head. "How do you know my name?" "I remember your father. He was a good employee." Sophie's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular intensity of a child who is weighing an adult's words against the evidence she has gathered from her own experience. Then how come you fired him? Catherine's mouth went dry. The champagne glass in her hand felt like it weighed 40 pounds. That's a complicated situation, sweetheart. My daddy says it's not complicated. He says he told the truth and nobody listened. The words landed like a verdict delivered by a witness, too young to know she was testifying and too honest to know she should hedge. Catherine felt the floor shift beneath her knees, a sensation that had nothing to do with the physical surface and everything to do with the ground she had been standing on since December 24th, the ground Martin Keene had constructed for her. The narrative she had accepted, the story she had chosen to believe, because believing it was easier than questioning it, and questioning it would mean confronting the possibility that she had done something unforgivable. Did someone trick you? 4 words, a child's question. The kind of question that has no politics and no agenda and no escape route, the kind that cuts through every defense a person has built because it assumes nothing except that the answer matters. Did someone trick you? Not an accusation, not a challenge. A genuine inquiry from a girl who loved her father and wanted to understand why the woman in charge had hurt him. Catherine looked into those dark, unblinking eyes and felt something give way in her that she had been holding in place with willpower and denial, in the sheer mechanical force of refusing to stop moving long enough to think. I don't know, she said, and it was the most honest sentence she had spoken in months. Sophie studied her for another moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her red coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. My daddy wrote this. I think you should read it. Catherine took the paper. Her hands were steady because she commanded them to be steady the way she had commanded every part of herself for 2 decades, but underneath the command, there was a tremor she could not suppress, the physiological evidence of a woman whose body had understood something her mind was still refusing to accept. Sophie turned and walked back to the craft table where Diane Brennan was watching with wide eyes and a phone in her hand, already composing a text to James that began with 3 words. She found Catherine. Catherine stood up. She held the paper at her side. She walked through the remainder of the gala with the same composure she had carried into every room for 22 years. She shook 3 more hands. She posed for a photograph with a board member. She excused herself at exactly 9:15 and walked to the elevator and rode it to a conference room on the floor above the ballroom and closed the door. She unfolded the paper. Ms. Mercer, I sent 47 emails to Martin Keene between September and December documenting unauthorized overnight trades totaling $40 million. He never responded. I requested 3 independent audits. All were denied. The trades were executed using administrator credentials assigned to his office, not mine. I have the server logs. You have my number. Ethan Caldwell. She read it 3 times. Then she sat down in an empty conference chair in an empty conference room in a hotel that was hosting a party she had paid for, and she opened her phone and called James Whitfield, Crestline's chief technology officer. James, I need you to pull the mail server delivery logs for Ethan Caldwell's account, September through December. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Catherine, it's 10 o'clock on a Saturday night. I know what time it is. I need timestamps. I need delivery confirmations. And I need them before morning. What are you looking for? I need to know if he sent emails to Martin Keene during that period. Another silence. Longer. Is there something I should know? Not yet. Just get me those logs. She hung up and opened her laptop. She carried it everywhere the way some people carry a weapon and logged into Crestline's trading systems audit trail. She searched for the 18 dates referenced in Ethan's letter, the overnight trades, 2 to 4 in the morning. She found every single one. The first trade executed at 2:47 a.m. on September 14th. The access credential used was an administrator code. She checked it against the company's credential registry, assigned to the Office of the Vice President of Finance. Martin Keene. She checked the second trade. Same credential. October 3rd, 2:12 a.m. She checked the 3rd, the 4th, the 8th, the 12th. It's 18. Same credential. All executed in the dead of night, all using Martin Keene's administrative access. Her fingers were trembling now, a fact she observed with the detached precision of a woman who had spent her career monitoring her own physical responses and was watching one she could not control. She pulled up Martin's expense reports for the same period. corporate card charges, hotel receipts, client dinners, travel filings. On September 14th, the night of the first unauthorized trade, Martin had filed an expense report for a dinner in Manhattan that ended at 11. He was in the city. He had access to the building. He could have been at his terminal at 2:47 in the morning. She cross-referenced every date, every trade, every night Martin was in New York with access to the building. The pattern was seamless, and it was damning. At midnight, James Whitfield called back. Catherine, I found the logs. Ethan Caldwell sent 47 emails to Martin Keene between September 8th and December 20th, all delivered successfully, all received by Keene's server. I can see red receipts on 31 of them. Martin opened those emails. Catherine closed her eyes. The conference room was dark except for the glow of her laptop and the city lights bleeding through the curtains. He read them. 31 confirmed opens. The rest were delivered, but I can't verify they were read. But Catherine, there's something else. Tell me. On December 22nd, 2 days before Caldwell was terminated, someone accessed the email server using Martin Keene's admin credentials and bulk deleted Caldwell's sent folder. The deletion was executed remotely from Keene's workstation. Not from Caldwell's account. From Keene's. The phone felt like iron against her ear. Martin had not just ignored the warnings. He had read 31 of them, and then 2 days before the termination, he had logged into the system and destroyed the evidence, deliberately, methodically, with the calculated precision of a man who had already decided who would take the fall and wanted to make sure the fall was clean. James, I need you to preserve everything you just found. Lock it down. No access, no deletion. No one touches it. Catherine, what's going on? Martin Keene committed fraud, and I fired the man who tried to stop it. She hung up. She sat in the dark conference room and felt the full structure of her certainty. 22 years of never being wrong, never doubting, never stopping to ask the one question that would have prevented everything collapse around her. Not explosively, not dramatically, but completely irrevocably, with the terrible finality of a thing that cannot be put back together because it was never as strong as it appeared. She thought about Ethan on the highway jumper cables in his hands. She thought about Sophie in the lobby candy cane red coat. She thought about the termination letter she had signed without asking a single question, the way she had gone home that night and poured champagne because she believed she had handled a crisis efficiently. Efficiently. The word made her physically ill now sitting in the dark because she understood finally what efficiency without empathy actually is. Intelligence without humility is just arrogance with better vocabulary. At 1 in the morning, Catherine Mercer called the firm's outside counsel and told him to assemble his team. At 6 in the morning, 4 attorneys from Whitmore and Kessler arrived at Crestline's offices and sat in the conference room on the 16th floor and opened the folder Catherine placed in front of them without preamble. David Whitmore, the senior partner, read for 10 minutes. Nobody spoke. When he finished, he removed his glasses. You terminated Caldwell based entirely on Keene's recommendation without independently verifying the evidence. Yes. And Keene had access to the trading system, the email server, and the authority to suppress internal reports. I gave him all of it. David closed the folder. Catherine, when the SEC sees this, and they will see this, whether we bring it to them or they find it themselves, they're not just going to investigate Keene. They're going to ask why the CEO of a major investment firm signed a termination on Christmas Eve without conducting even a basic review of the underlying evidence. I know. Are you prepared for what that means? I'm prepared to tell the truth. That's why you're here. By 7:45 a.m., 2 agents from the SEC's Division of Enforcement were on a conference call with Catherine's legal team. By 8:30, a formal voluntary disclosure had been initiated. By 9, an independent forensic accounting firm had been retained to audit Crestline's trading operations for the past 18 months. And at 9:15, 2 federal agents walked into the lobby of Crestline Capital. They took the elevator to the 15th floor. They turned left down the corridor that led to the office of the Vice President of Finance. Martin Keene's assistant stood up when she saw them. Can I help you? The taller agent showed his badge. We don't need an appointment. Martin was on the phone when they opened his door. He looked up. He saw the badges. His face traveled through 3 stages in less than 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and a fear so total it erased every trace of the composure he had maintained for 12 years. The mask did not slip. It shattered. Martin Keene, federal agents. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Please stand up and put your hands where we can see them. His phone clattered on the desk. The person on the other end was still talking. His voice cracked on the last syllable of the sentence he managed to produce. There must be a mistake. You'll have the opportunity to contact counsel after processing. Please stand up, sir. He stood. The handcuffs were cold. The walk from his desk to the elevator was 40 steps. In those 40 steps, Martin Keene passed 9 employees who had gathered in the corridor. Every one of them watched. One of them. Nobody spoke. The silence was total, the silence of people witnessing something they had suspected but never expected to see, the silence of a building that had just learned it had been lied to for years by a man it trusted. The elevator doors opened. The agents stepped in with Martin between them. The doors closed. 12 years of lies ended in 40 steps and a pair of handcuffs. Catherine made her call to Ethan that afternoon. 4 rings. His voice was guarded, tired, the voice of a man who had been fighting a war nobody could see for 3 months and was beginning to wonder if the war had an end. Ethan, this is Catherine Mercer. Silence. Long, heavy, the kind of silence that contains years. My lawyer already called me. Then you know Martin was arrested this morning. I know. Ethan, I need to say something to you and I need you to hear it. She gripped the phone. The Manhattan skyline stretched behind her through the windows of the office where she had signed his termination, and the view that had once meant power now meant something else, a reminder of the height from which it is possible to look down and miss everything that matters. I was wrong, not partially, not because of bad information, fundamentally wrong. You tried to protect this company. You followed every protocol. You sent 47 warnings. And I fired you because I trusted the wrong man and didn't have the humility to question my own judgment. I terminated you on Christmas Eve while your daughter sat in my lobby. I didn't ask you a single question about your reports. I didn't check the server logs. I made a decision based on someone else's lies, and that decision destroyed your livelihood and your reputation. He did not respond. She could hear breathing through the phone, slow, shaking the sound of a man releasing something he had been carrying so long it had become part of him. I can't undo that. I know I can't. But I want you to know that I'm going to stand in front of this entire company tomorrow and tell them what happened. And I'm going to make sure everyone who works at Crestline understands that you were not the failure. I was. His voice was quiet when it came. My daughter asks about you. She doesn't understand why the boss lady fired her daddy. I've tried to explain it 100 ways. None of them make sense to an 8-year-old. Because it doesn't make sense. The night you fired me, I went home and made Christmas cookies with my daughter. I read her a story, tucked her in. Then I sat at the kitchen table and stared at 47 emails that proved I was innocent and wondered if anyone would ever read them. I'm reading them now, 2 months too late. I know. She offered him his position back. Full back pay from December 24th. A cleared record. A promotion, senior director of a new whistleblower protection division, reporting directly to the board. I need to think about it. Take whatever time you need. And Catherine, tomorrow, when you stand in front of that company, don't do it for PR. Don't do it because your lawyers told you it would look good. Do it because it's right. The next morning at 9, every employee at Crestline Capital gathered in the main auditorium. Standing room only. The energy in the room was tense and confused and afraid. They had all seen Martin Keene walked out in handcuffs, and they all wanted to know what it meant for their mom and their company and the ground beneath their feet. Catherine walked to the front. No podium, no prepared remarks, no teleprompter. She stood in front of 500 people who had trusted her to lead them, and she told them the truth. 2 months ago, I fired Ethan Caldwell on Christmas Eve. I did it because Martin Keene told me Ethan's department was responsible for a $40 million loss. I didn't verify the evidence. I didn't review Ethan's reports. I didn't ask him a single question. I signed the termination letter and sent him home with a box and his 8-year-old daughter. She paused. The silence in the room had weight. She could feel it pressing against her from every direction. That was the worst decision I have ever made, not because of the legal exposure, Not because of the financial damage, because it was wrong. Ethan Caldwell spent months trying to warn us about a fraud happening inside this building. He sent 47 emails. He filed risk reports. He requested audits. He did everything a responsible ethical employee is supposed to do, and he was punished for it. By me. Her voice cracked on the last two words. She did not try to repair it. I trusted authority instead of evidence. I trusted rank instead of truth. And I was so confident in my own judgment that I never stopped to ask the one question that would have changed everything. What if I'm wrong? The room was still. Then from the back, a single person began clapping. Slowly, then another. Then the entire room. Catherine did not smile. She did not bow. She stood there and absorbed it, not as applause, but as measure of the distance between who she had been and who she was trying to become. Ethan waited 6 weeks before he accepted the offer. He called Frank Torelli in April from the kitchen table where he had sat through the worst nights of his life. I'm going back, but I have conditions. Go ahead. Direct reporting to the board. Not Catherine, not any executive. The board. They'll push back. Then I don't go. What else? Automatic protection for anyone who files an internal concern. No transfers, no reassignments, no performance reviews within 60 days of a complaint. Family first scheduling. I pick up Sophie at 3:15 every day. No exceptions, and zero tolerance for retaliation. If anyone retaliates against a whistleblower, I have the authority to recommend immediate termination. You're not making this easy. It shouldn't be easy. If it were easy, they wouldn't need me. Before he signed, he called Pittsburgh. Henry answered on the second ring the way he always did, present, unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent 70 years learning that the most important calls come when you least expect them. Dad, I'm going back. Back to the place that fired you. Not for them, for the person inside that building who's seeing something wrong right now and is afraid to speak. I'm going back to be the person I needed and didn't have. Henry was quiet for a moment. Then you go, and you tell Sophie why. Let her see what it looks like when her father stands up for something. That's the inheritance that matters. The negotiations took 9 days. Catherine's lawyers pushed back on the board reporting. Ethan held. They pushed back on the retaliation authority. Ethan held. They pushed back on the scheduling. Catherine overruled her own legal team on that one. Give him everything he wants. On May 15th, a Monday, Ethan Caldwell stood outside Crestline Capital. At 8:45 in the morning, the building had not changed. Glass and steel, the company name in polished letters, people flowing through the revolving door with coffee cups and security badges. The last time he had walked through those doors, he was carrying a cardboard box and holding his daughter's hand and trying not to come apart. 5 months ago, a different season, a different man. He took a breath. He adjusted his tie. He walked in. The elevator took him to the 14th floor. His office was 2 doors down from the cubicle where he had spent 8 years. His name was on the door, Senior Director, Whistleblower Protection Division. He put his bag down. He sat in the chair. He looked at the empty desk and the blank walls and the window that looked out over the same city that had nearly swallowed him. Catherine knocked on his open door at 9:30. She stood in the threshold, not entering the posture of a woman asking permission to occupy a space she once controlled completely. Is everything in order? Do you need anything? I need people to trust this office. That's going to take time. I know, she paused. I want to be honest with you about something. Please. I didn't come here to manage your transition. I came because I owe you more than a phone call and a benefits package. I owe you the truth about why I made the decision I made, and the truth is not that Martin deceived me. The truth is that I let him deceive me because questioning him would have meant questioning myself, and I had spent 22 years building an identity around the belief that I was never wrong. Your termination wasn't a failure of information. It was a failure of character. Mine. He looked at her for a long time. Thank you for saying that. It doesn't fix anything. No, but it's a start. She turned to leave. Catherine, she stopped. I didn't come back for you. I didn't come back for the money or the title. I came back because somewhere in this building right now, someone sees something wrong and is afraid to speak. They're afraid because they saw what happened to me. I came back to be the person I needed and didn't have. That's the only reason. She nodded once and walked away. In June, the first real test arrived. Kelly Warren, a junior analyst in the fixed income division, filed a complaint through the new system. Her managing director was pressuring her team to alter risk assessments, making products look safer than they were. She had emails, meeting notes, dates. She sat in Ethan's office with her hands folded in her lap and the particular fear in her eyes that he recognized immediately because he had seen it in his own reflection for 3 months. Everyone knows what happened to you, Mr. Caldwell. Then everyone knows I'm sitting in this chair, and the man who tried to silence me is in federal custody. That's not a story about how the system fails. That's a story about what happens when someone is brave enough to tell the truth, even when it costs them. Her eyes glisten. I'm not brave. I'm scared. Those aren't mutually exclusive. I was scared every day for 3 months. But I had the evidence, and I had my daughter looking at me every night, and I knew that if I didn't do the right thing, I'd have to explain to her someday why I chose silence. The investigation took 3 weeks. Kelly's concerns were confirmed. The managing director was terminated. No retaliation, no leaks. By September, the division had received 14 complaints. 11 were substantiated. Not a single employee who filed experienced any form of consequence. October brought Take Your Child to Work Day. Ethan and Sophie walked through the revolving door together at 8:30. She was wearing her red coat slightly tighter now, the sleeves a quarter-inch short at the wrists, and she held his hand and looked up at the lobby the way you look at a place that holds both the worst memory and the newest beginning of your life. They took the elevator to 14. Sophie walked into his office and immediately spotted the framed drawing on his desk, the one she had made in January, the apartment with the Christmas tree, and the smiling stick figure of her father. You kept it. Of course I kept it. It's the best thing in this office. She walked to the door and read the nameplate, sounding out the words slowly. Senior Director, whistle, blower, protection. She looked at him. What does that mean? He knelt beside her. It means that if someone in this company sees something wrong, something dishonest or unfair, they can come to me, and I make sure they're safe. I make sure nobody punishes them for telling the truth. She considered this with the gravity of a child processing a large idea through a small frame. Like what happened to you. Exactly like what happened to me. So you make sure it doesn't happen to other people. That's the job. That's a really good job, Daddy. Catherine came to the 14th floor at 10. When she saw Sophie, her composure shifted, a softening around her eyes, the involuntary response of a woman who had spent 2 decades controlling every external signal and was now unable to control this one. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Sophie. I'm glad you're here. Daddy says you're the boss. One of them, but your daddy is in charge of something very important too. Sophie reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I made you something. Catherine took it. She unfolded it carefully. 2 stick figures standing side by side in front of a tall building. Between them, holding both their hands, was a small girl in a red coat. Underneath, in Sophie's careful handwriting, good people fix things. Catherine held the drawing for a long time. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes glistened. She folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest. Thank you, Sophie. I'm going to keep this. You can put it on your desk. That's what Daddy did. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Catherine walked away. Ethan watched her pause at the end of the corridor, press the drawing against her chest one more time, take a breath, and turn the corner. Later that month, on a Sunday afternoon, James and Diane Brennan hosted a barbecue at their place in Bayside. Sophie had been invited and had insisted on going because Diane had promised face painting. The yard was small and the grill was too close to the fence, and the neighbor's dog kept barking through the slats, but the sun was out and the air smelled like charcoal in autumn. Rachel Dawson was there, Diane's friend, 40 years old, a teacher at PS 122 in Astoria, widowed 3 years. She had dark hair and the kind of face that was beautiful without being aware of it, the face of a woman who spent her days with 7-year-olds and had developed an immunity to pretense. Sophie noticed her before Ethan did, noticed that Rachel could fold a napkin into the shape of a rabbit, which Sophie considered a talent of the highest order, and within 10 minutes the two of them were sitting cross-legged on the grass, making an entire zoo from paper napkins, while Ethan stood by the grill with James and watched. They talked for an hour about Sophie's school, about Rachel's classroom, about the particular challenge of teaching second graders to sit still during assemblies, which Rachel described with a deadpan humor that made Ethan laugh in a way he had not laughed in a long time. Not the careful laugh he produced for Sophie's benefit, not the professional laugh he deployed in meetings, but the involuntary genuine article, the sound of a man surprised by his own capacity for joy. On the drive home, Sophie was quiet for 3 blocks. Then she spoke. "Daddy, do you like Miss Rachel? She seems really nice. She knows how to make a rabbit out of a napkin. I noticed. Mommy only knew triangles." A silence. The kind that fills a car when a child has said something enormous without knowing it. "But I still like triangles better." Ethan reached across the seat and took her hand. "Me too." Sophie squeezed his fingers. "But maybe we could see Miss Rachel again sometime." "Maybe. She makes good napkin animals." A pause. "And she laughed at my jokes. Marta never laughs at my jokes." Ethan smiled, not the smile he assembled, the other one. They pulled up to the apartment building in Astoria, and Sophie climbed out and stood on the sidewalk in her red coat, with the sleeves that were getting too short, and looked up at her father. "Daddy, yeah, I like your new job." "I like it too, Soph." "And Daddy, yeah, I'm glad you didn't give up." He took her hand and they walked toward the entrance. The same building, the same stairs, the same apartment with the brick wall view and the clanking radiator, and the kitchen table where the photograph of Grace at Coney Island sat on the shelf beside the lopsided angel smiling the ocean behind her, the sun in her hair. Ethan hung up his coat. Sophie hung up hers, the red one, getting small now, but still worn every day. The fabric softened by a year of constant use. The color faded just enough to prove it was loved. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table and thought about a year that had started with a shattered coffee cup on a mahogany desk and was ending with his name on an office door and his daughter's hand in his, in the first tentative possibility that the world might contain more than survival. He did not know what would happen with Rachel. He did not know whether the company he had returned to would keep the promises Catherine had made. He did not know whether the system that had chewed him up would prove capable of the reform it had claimed to embrace. He knew only this: he had told the truth. He had held the evidence. He had stood straight the way Henry Caldwell had told him to stand, and he had walked back into the building that had tried to destroy him, not for revenge and not for money, but for the person inside it who needed what he had needed and didn't have someone who would listen, someone who would act, someone who would make sure the lights came on. Sophie called from the living room. "Daddy, can you help me with math? The hard ones." Ethan Caldwell walked out of the kitchen. He sat down beside his daughter. He picked up a pencil. And he helped her with the hard ones because that was the bomb, and it had always been the job, and everything else was just the distance between what the world takes from you and what you refuse to let go.